thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction. Yeah. I think you recall it absolutely correctly. I think we met with Dahlia Albert. Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, today we are talking about the topic of nation building, and this topic has come to the fore very recently, and I congratulate the organizers for putting this up for discussion during this Congress. Now, when I first came to Germany, I was very curious and wanted to find out more about this country and what makes Germany stands out heads and heels over the rest of the world when we talk about industrial products, when we talk about machine tools, when we talk about factory industries. Because in Asia, when we think of buying industrial products, when we think of buying industrial goods, we think that Germany is equated with quality. German products are the best in the world. And I think that if there's a real value to any product, if it can be termed made in Germany when you try to sell that product in Asia, I'm quite certain it's the same in many other parts of the world. Now, to me, this is really nation branding at its best. Because, for any German manufacturer, for any German businesses, the fact that you are German already puts you a step ahead of the competition as you go around the world. So this is really nation building at its best. And this is something that we and I from Singapore would like very much to learn from. Now, a nation's brand is really its reputation. It is the face of the country in the world. And nation building is all about how you are perceived by the rest of the world, but really, if you think about it, it's about you as a country, about your performance and what you stand for in the world. Now, Singapore is a small island nation state. I do not know how many of you have been to Singapore, but we are sometimes described as the little red dot in Southeast Asia. So I hope that Mr. Donfried have, tried to identify where Singapore is as part of your introduction to this Congress. Now, we are a real small nation state, and with no natural resources. And the only way we can make a living, prosper, and for Singaporeans to bring up our children and make a decent living is for us to be relevant to the rest of the world, for us to play a role in value adding to international relationships, to international trade, to international businesses. Now, hence, branding and perception of Singapore is very important to our development. Now, Singapore as a brand, I'm happy to say, has done fairly well. Now, what do I mean by that? Because I'm happy that, in my second tour as living in Europe, it's a very different experience than when I was a student in England. In the 1970s and 1980s, when I tell people in England that I come from Singapore, they ask me which part of China that's from. Today, coming back to live in Europe, I don't have this problem anymore. A lot of people do know about Singapore, and they're curious about what makes this tiny, small island state successful. And the reason is because, as I said, we have a certain brand name, and it is identified by excellence, efficiency, quality. It is underpinned by a strong set of values, such as reliability, meritocracy, and fair play. Our government is associated with stability, transparency, little or no corruption, and the whole economic climate in our country, as the President here would know, is very pro-business, very open to trade and investment, and general good rule of law. And as a country, Singapore, if you talk to tourists and visitors, we are seen as a safe and secure country, clean and green, friendly, and very open to the world. Now, this international reputation is constantly reinforced by the large presence of foreigners and foreign companies in Singapore. Now, before coming to this Congress, I checked, and we have more than 7,000 multinationals in this tiny country of only 700 square kilometers. Now, about 1/3 of our total resident population, and the population of Singapore is about 5 million, about 1/3 of them hold foreign passports. But according to the Barry report for 2009, our labor force ranks as number 1 in the world. The World Bank Doing Business 2011 report named Singapore as the easiest place to do business. Singapore is also seen as the best place to protect your intellectual property, even ahead of countries like Sweden, Finland, and Switzerland. And according to the Mercer's June 2010 Quality of Living Survey, Singapore is ranked as the best place to live, work, and play in Asia, and among the top 10 places to live, work, and play in the world. So, all these international surveys help our reputation. Now, if I just bring you back a little bit to the days of independence in Singapore, this Singapore branding did not happen overnight because, as I said, in the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s, when I lived in Europe, very few people knew where Singapore was. Now, it has taken many years of nation building to transform our economy and the country. In fact, just 2 generations ago, Singapore was a third world country with a GNP per capita of $320. Squatters, squalor, infrastructure was poor, little capital, and only a very handful of industries produced for domestic consumption. High unemployment, there was constant threats of unrest and social, racial tensions. So what do? We are a small country, so we buckle down to manage. And the key was to build our economy. Slowly, through hard work, more work, and harder work, we grew and upgraded our quality of life for our people. Because just remember, we are only 700 square kilometers with absolutely no natural resources. We don't even have water of our own. So since independence in 1965, I'm happy to share with you that our economy has grown by more than 7% per annum. And by 2000, our per capita GNP was $23,500, and last year it was $43,000, according to the IMF. And today our economy is diversified, with manufacturing as the largest sector. And total trade for Singapore, and we are one of those very special, very open country where total trade of Singapore is 3 times that of GDP, which came in at US dollars 704 billion, 3 times the size of our GDP. So in short, I think that nation building for Singapore came about because we worked hard to upgrade the product. We were lucky technology and world development, global trends, allow a small country to hook up to nodes around the world and develop ourselves. And the international reputation itself, in turn, helped us continue to grow our economy. So in short, we are pretty much in a virtuous cycle now of having worked hard to build the commodity, to build a country that's been fairly successful, and that success has now created a reputation and the branding, and that reputation and the branding has now made it easier for us to sell our country as a place for business, for leisure, as well as for international tourists. Now, the quality of the product created the brand. The reputation of the brand helps us create a better product. And so hopefully we can continue in this virtuous cycle. But we don't take this for granted because, Singapore, if you ask me 20 years ago, we like to call ourselves a garden city. But today, if you ask Singaporeans, we don't call ourselves a garden city anymore. We call ourselves a city in the garden. Okay, because, the way we project, the way we market ourselves moves with the time and is different. In these days and age where people talk about greening your environment, this whole concept of that we live in a green and sustainable city is so important. And so a new concept comes up. So we are constantly upgrading, renewing ourselves. We have built a new downtown. And from, in tourism promotion, well, 2 years ago, we talked about uniquely Singapore. But as of last year, we have rebranded ourselves as Your Singapore, because now we are confident that we give tourists a choice of what you want out of your travel. You want nature, you want science, you want beach. You create what you like to see when you come to Singapore. And for economics, from a place as a manufacturing-based center, we now talk about Singapore as a home for business, for international business, either a home away from your own home or a real global home for you as you do business in Asia and the world. So these are just some of the examples of ways we constantly work on the way we project ourselves in Singapore. And we think that in Singapore, at a time when Asia wasn't growing very well, we have managed a trajectory of good growth and a fair bit of success. In today's context, when Asia is growing very strongly, when China is growing strongly, with India growing strongly, where China and India are hopefully meeting in Southeast Asia and hopefully meeting in Singapore, we think there are abundant opportunities in Asia and in Singapore. And so I would like to ask you to consider doing business in Singapore and to take full advantage of our strong position and branding and come to Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Again, thank you. We'd like to take a few questions, if you have any, please, for the Ambassador.
Your Excellency, I would like to add a few comments to the very pertinent points you made about Singapore, because I'm myself a great admirer of what Singapore has achieved. I remember the first time I got to Singapore, I was going to Jakarta, and at 7 o'clock in the morning, I saw all your school children dressed to go to school. When I got to Jakarta, it was then that the Indonesian children were going to school. The philosophy of Singapore was that we've got to be a few steps ahead because we didn't have resources. This is a great tribute to the leadership of your great leader, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, now is known as a senior minister. Now, I'm also very impressed with a recent article you wrote in New York Times that when independence came and you were confronted with a choice of languages, although you're predominantly Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, some people are speaking Malay and Indian, Singapore decided to adopt the English language as a unifying language. I think the world's got a lot to learn. So far as I'm concerned, the place may be small, but it is in no means inhabited by small people. If there are small people, there are small people with big brains. Thank you.
Well, Mr. President, you are most kind. I think you know us very well. And so you in particular would know the kind of challenges we had when we first became independent. I mean, 700 square kilometers, uneducated population, no natural resources. As I said, not even water, We, in fact, the President here knows our leaders, they didn't believe that we could survive on our own. And therefore, the fight for independence was to fight to merge with Malaysia. I don't know whether there are any Malaysians here, but those who do know the history of Southeast Asia will know that we wanted to be part of Malaysia. But unfortunately, because of politics, it was not possible, and we found ourselves suddenly independent in 1965. But, as you said, we had only one resource. And in a way, when you have no choice, it gets easier sometimes, because you just have people. So what do we, as you said, education is very important, continues to be very important. In fact, education today accounts for the second highest budget item in any Singapore budget. In fact, I would say that education is about, I think, 15% of our annual budget. So it's a very big ticket item, and it is something that we emphasize a lot, develop human capital, because that's the only way we can make a living and prosper. But, Mr. President, as you would have noticed in Singapore, the British left us an education system. We continued some of the best traditions of the English education system. So one thing is mandatory in Singapore, in schools in Singapore, is school uniforms. So when I came to Berlin and looked for an international school for my kid, in the good tradition of the British education system, I also chose the British school here because they have uniforms. But that's just a personal take on the issue. But let me just say that the organizers have asked me to give a fairly long speech, and I felt that it was not necessary. Rather, I kept my speech short because I wanted a more interactive exchange and discussion with all of you, because I would also like to learn from you what your perceptions of Singapore are, and how perhaps we can even, whether there are areas that we should be focusing on to improve ourselves, and what more we can do together. Please.
I'm a student from Germany,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned that 1/3 of the population in Singapore holds a foreign citizenship. In Germany and in whole of Europe, migration is a very critical topic, and it seems that the migration laws are getting more and more strict. So I was wondering, how does Singapore manage its migration? How are the migration policies, and what is actually the economic impact of that?
Well, we are completely multicultural and multi-religious. In fact, I think almost every religion is represented in Singapore. Eleni, correct me, I think almost every religion is represented in Singapore. But our starting point is very different from Germany, because in Germany you are a very homogeneous society. So the way you address the issue of immigrants might be different. In Singapore, we are a completely immigrant society, and as the President said here, we have to constantly expand the common space to create a country. We can't have a country divided along racial, religious, and other fault lines, because then otherwise you can't create Singapore. You can't create a Singaporean identity and what it means to be Singapore. So what do is that we try to find common elements across all the cultures and religion and try to constantly expand that space. So one very fundamental tenets of our nation-building exercise is to always respect each and every individual ethnic identity, religion, culture. At the same time, a very important plank of nation-building is to constantly expand that common space across all the religion and across all the races in Singapore and cultures. So I think you've heard that one of the first acts of Singapore was to make English the working language. But it is not the national language of Singapore. The national language of Singapore is actually Malay, Bahasa Melayu. And the official languages of Singapore is that you can actually transact with government in 4 official languages. But because the common language when a Chinese talks to an Indian, or an Indian talks to a Malay talks to a Chinese, it is to be English. Over the last 40 years, the amount of transactions done in English have expanded. And because international economic opportunities have also predominantly been more for the English educated and English speaking, parents started to emphasize English to their children. So you find that with my children now, English is their best language rather than their original mother tongue. But at the same time, to continue to promote, one's culture, religion, we emphasize the teaching of mother tongue in all our schools, in our school system. So we have a bilingual approach to every education of every child. So come back to your question, I would say approaches have to be tailored to a country's circumstances, because I think if you talk about integration, you have a far more homogeneous society in Germany. In Singapore, we constantly try to expand that common ground.
My name is Bonsu. I head an African-German association in Hamburg. As a young student in 1988, I did visit your island state because I wanted to see as much of this world as possible, and I was fascinated by Singapore's progress. You've given a very rosy picture of Singapore. I want to ask one very candid question. We have the problem of the West. I wouldn't say the international community, especially the West. And you know the problems the West had with your senior minister, despite all the economic progress. I remember the sending off of the economists, correspondents, etc. One basic tenet you failed to mention today, you've talked about hard work, working harder, and then doing more work. One thread I see through Singapore's success was the importance of discipline. We must have laissez-faire economies in Africa, all over the world, watch Hollywood movies 75% of the time, and then ask ourselves or become surprised why our children don't get the best out of education while Singaporean children lead the world in science and technology exams. And when a great African leader who's seen his country through genocide and everything decides to inculcate discipline in his educational system, lay emphasis on science and technology in a landlocked African country with a small population, a former military general. I am not a citizen of Rwanda. I'm a citizen of Ghana. But we heard yesterday, you see, there are accusations, he's a dictator. We cannot compare Paul Kagame to other well-known, dictators. And these were the terms we were trying to use to describe the great senior minister of your country in the 80s and then, in the early 90s. My simple question is, do you think, I don't want to say cynicism, do you think there's something wrong with the perception of the West when it comes to a regime led by a strong leader who inculcates a certain measure of discipline, this efficiency of coordination, which has led to your nation's success, as opposed to open and well-known cases of dictatorship, which are in any way sponsored and probably tolerated by the West in the name of ensuring security. Do you think there is a problem here, His Excellency? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, I think from your exposition, you are also another who know us very well. So I think, first of all, I just want to correct it if I left you with an impression that there's a rosy picture in Singapore, because in Singapore we always feel vulnerable because we have no natural resources, and we keep telling our people that you cannot take today's success for granted for the next lap, and you have to constantly keep ahead of the competition and keep ahead of the curve. And so there's still a lot more hard work going forward. I just want to make that clear. Yeah. I think your question of perceptions of Singapore, I think as you correctly point out, by the way, he's now Minister Mentor, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, because we have a the second prime minister who became senior minister. So Minister Lee Kuan Yew is now minister mentor. I think that what drove the first generation of leaders in Singapore was just one and only one thing. Is that they were elected by, at that time, 3 million, in fact, less than 3 million people, for only one reason. And what is that reason? That reason is that we are an impoverished, poor country, and please help uplift our standard of living. And so we were fortunate that to have a generation of very committed leaders whose sole responsibility was not their international reputation vis-a-vis, the world or the press, but their responsibility and their commitment to fulfilling the aspirations of the Singaporeans who elected them. And having the commitment and the conviction to do what is right, what they believe that is right, that will uplift the standard of living. And I think that for them, the yardstick every year, every 5 years, every 4 or 5 years, when it came to general elections time, that was the test of whether they have lived up to their expectations. And as long as the people of Singapore gave them this mandate, then they felt that they were on the right track. And so for them, their basic premise is that as long as they continue to develop the economy, the people feel that they have actually delivered at every term of parliament to them. That was the key thing they need to focus on. So while I think all international leaders would like to be much beloved not just in their country but also internationally, that was, I would say, something that had to come secondary. So obviously, at a time when, in the 60s, when you have race tensions, you had race riots, you had religious strife, certain measures are needed to keep the peace, to bring the country up on the virtuous path of development. And I think that maybe in the 70s and the 80s, there were more of such comments about the models of development. But today, those same countries that talk about, the need for the Western form of democracy, of the kind of liberalism that's associated, they themselves are now sometimes reversing course. So I think today it's probably easier to discuss with these countries about some of their earlier comments about Asia or about Singapore. I mean, in France, for example, you see a certain change in the way they look at individual rights, about whether you can how you dress for public service, things like that. So I would say that what drove our leaders was a certain commitment and a certain focus on delivering it for the people, the economic goods, well-being. I hope I answered your question.
Just for the point of a correction, I didn't want to say the general Western perspective. I didn't want to criticize liberalism. I was referring to neo-liberalist view of the world. Sorry. So that's just for the purpose of the audience. This kind of, we want to go teach the whole world. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We'd like to give again His Excellency Ambassador Foo a big round of applause.